In 1976, Sega released Heavyweight Champ, the very first one-on-one combat game giving birth to an entire genre. Fast forward to 1992 and the three biggest video game franchises on the planet were Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Mario and Street Fighter. And while Street Fighter 2 wasn't the first one-on-one fighting game, its influence on the genre cannot be denied. It redefined what the genre could be, brought the arcade scene kicking and screaming into a second golden age, and was earning Capcom billions of dollars in the process. In addition to dominating the arcade, Nintendo had signed Street Fighter 2 on as a console exclusive for their Super Nintendo system, and to great success, helping the console fight back against a Sonic-fueled Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. Sega had Sonic, who was their answer to Mario. They did not have an answer for Street Fighter, and while various responses would arrive on their console, including a version of Street Fighter 2 itself in 1993, Sega needed something for the arcade. So they turned to their in-house genius Yu Suzuki, the father of Hang-On, Outrun, Afterburner, Space Harrier, and so many more. Hot off the heels of the industry-defining virtual racing, Yu was tasked by Sega to create a rival to Street Fighter. "I don't know if I'll be successful, but I'll give it a try," was Suzuki-san's response. Little did anyone know that the game wouldn't just challenge Street Fighter 2, but like Heavyweight Champ, it would change the entire video game industry forever. And that game was Virtua Fighter.
Yu Suzuki went about this challenge with the same perfectionist search for authenticity that he applied to previous projects. While Outrun had taken him across Europe to map out his cross-continental drive, and Hang-On had him studying motorbikes and rider Freddie Spencer, this brand new fighting project would see him study hundreds of martial arts videos and movies. The order of the day was realism, from how the fighters moved to the physics themselves. I decided to spend all my efforts to make character movement correct and realistic. Suzuki-san later said in an interview that yes, Street Fighter had nice sprites, but we had the advantage of very smooth movements. To achieve this level of realism, he needed the most advanced arcade technology available. At that time, that was Sega's Model 1 board. Having already delivered the blockbuster Virtua Racing, it was the perfect fit to provide Suzuki-san with the level of fluidity he was striving to achieve. Sega's Model 2 hardware was in its infancy at the time, and AM2 split into two teams to deliver Virtua Fighter and a Model 2 tech demo, which would later become a little game known as Daytona USA. As development progressed into 1993, Virtua Fighter was shown off at trade shows in various states of completion. The response was enthusiastic, although its impact was lessened somewhat by the prominence of Namco's own secret weapon, a certain texture-mapped racing game called Ridge Racer. You may have heard of it. Sega had their own answer for that, but in the meantime, no game was coming close to what Sega was attempting. 4D Sports Boxing, which had beaten Virtua Fighter to the punch in terms of 3D motion captured combat, was still very basic with a fixed camera and extremely basic looking fighters. As Virtua Fighter neared completion, hype for Suzuki's new game reached a crescendo as gaming magazines labelled it the new Street Fighter 2, waxing lyrical that you simply had to see this game in action to believe how good it is.
In October 1993, ironically, the same month that Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition released on the Mega Drive, Virtua Fighter made its way into the arcades. The game had changed a little from early previews. The Arabian character Sheba was replaced with the more Ryu looking Akira, and some of the character names had changed, but the end product was truly a sight to see. Its impact was pronounced, and while not initially the worldwide phenomenon that Street Fighter 2 was, it won over everyone who saw it. Sure, by the time of its release, Ridge Racer and the test version of the Model 2 Daytona USA had rendered flat shaded polygons a little outdated. But while Ridge Racer and Daytona were evolutions of polygonal driving games which had actually existed since the late 80s, there was nothing that looked, moved and played like Virtua Fighter did. As well as being a technical showpiece, the game played incredibly well. So well that it did eventually become a phenomenon in Japan, becoming the highest grossing game of 1994 in that region, neck and neck with the juggernaut that was Super Street Fighter 2X. It even passed the original Outrun as Sega's most successful coin-op ever, with in excess of a staggering 40,000 machines sold worldwide. Critical reception was positive too. Edge magazine remarked that the 3D scrolling, animation and movement are all silky smooth and very realistic, and that the fluid animation and imaginative camera angles quickly won the audience over. And while some outlets in the West bemoaned a lack of special moves, the game was near universally lauded as the benchmark on which all future fighting games would be assessed. And in Virtua Fighter's immediate aftermath, they weren't wrong.
To say Virtua Fighter changed the fighting genre is an understatement. Did Virtua Fighter change the gaming industry? Absolutely, and it happened almost overnight. In its immediate aftermath, companies were scrambling around trying to find an answer to Sega's latest smash hit. The 3D fighting subgenre had come out throwing haymakers with Virtua Fighter, and everyone wanted a piece of that pie. A tech demo in the offices of Namco was quickly transformed into a 3D fighter in response to Virtua Fighter, with several of Sega's development staff poached by their arcade rival to work on a title called Tekken. As more and more Virtua Fighter copycats began development, the industry as a whole began to shift. Nowhere was this felt more than deep in the bowels of Sony, where the 2D focused PlayStation was scrapped entirely as Sega's cutting edge new game forced Sony to change focus and make 3D a priority. Desperate for a Virtua Fighter clone, they joined forces with Namco, who agreed to make their Tekken game for the arcade version of the PSX hardware. This, in turn, drove the hardware design of every console that came after, including Sega's future hardware decisions, with the objective to bring their arcade titan into the home.
It felt like a foregone conclusion that Virtua Fighter could not come to Sega's existing hardware at the time, the Mega Drive. Even the Sega Virtua processor, which had delivered an impressive port of Virtua Racing, simply couldn't do justice to this seminal arcade game. Bringing Virtua Fighter home then fell to the upcoming Sega Saturn, now equipped with a second SH2 processor to help it process more geometry. A build was showcased in June 1994, representing only 2 weeks worth of work, which suggests that the total development time for the port was only 6 months. When it finally launched side by side with the Saturn in 1994, it was a huge financial success, selling over 500,000 copies at an attach rate of 1:1 with the console. In the modern day, there's this view that Virtua Fighter on the Saturn was a disappointment, that the flickering polygons turned off a lot of would-be buyers. But this just wasn't true at the time. The game was a sales phenomenon in Japan, and was lauded at both its Japanese and Western launches. Both Edge and Next Generation, notorious stingy scorers, awarded it high grades, with Edge's 9 being extremely prestigious, seeing as a 10 wouldn't be awarded for another 2 years. Critically and commercially then, it was a success, particularly in Japan. So where did the complaints come from? Playing it now, the glitching polygons are something of an eyesore, but they're only really prominent in the replay and attract modes. And even then, when played on a CRT, they're nowhere near as obvious as many people would have you believe, and there were certainly very few complaints about them in its day. In their review of the PAL version, CMVG even suggested that they'd been fixed, which says to me that the popping was mostly acknowledged during the Western launch, and was slight enough that some didn't even notice it. But in the wake of pretenders to its crown in Tekken and Toshinden, Sega were already hard at work at another port for the Saturn. A remix, you could say. Indeed, Virtua Fighter Remix was completed in May of 1995 and both bundled with the console and given away to Saturn owners who'd registered their console beforehand. Now Remix swaps the flat shaded polygons for texture maps, which changes the look of the game dramatically. At the time, this was in keeping with what the industry wanted. Even the arcade original took some criticism for its visuals in the wake of the Model 2 and Namco System 22 titles that were incoming, but nowadays, we at the Sega guys feel it loses some of the original's charm. There is this view that Remix is an apology for a rushed original port, but the timing suggests that this just isn't the case. It was in development well before criticism of the first port became louder. That said, the timing was strange, especially with regards to the US launch, for which it could have been ready. In fact, we have discussed whether both versions could have been bundled, allowing players to decide which they prefer. An interesting approach, considering what came later. Later still, in 1995, some 2 years after the arcade original, came the 32X port. The downclocked SH2s in the 32X and weaker GPU result in a heavily compromised version. Cleverly, fighters have reduced detail during battle, but are rendered at almost Saturn quality in the victory screens. Some actually prefer this to the Saturn version, but given the blockier fighters, weak sound, and occasional slowdown, we can't say we agree. Finally, in 1996, Virtua Fighter came to PC. Now, this release does allow players to toggle between the original and remixed graphics on the fly. It even allows you to mix texture map stages and characters together with flat shaded ones. Now, it is based off the Saturn version, and while it is capable of higher resolutions, interestingly, it still has more than its fair share of polygonal glitching. And just like any 1995 Windows game, it can be a little bit of a pain to get working on modern hardware.
It's almost criminal that there hasn't been a new port of Virtua Fighter since 1996's PC release, and no arcade perfect conversion exists to this day. So what's the best way to play it? Given the cutbacks of the 32X version, it feels like the weakest way to play. Sure, the gameplay is there, albeit with some slight slowdown, but the grandeur of the arcade game is lost in translation, and it's far from the optimum experience. The PC port would, you'd think, be the clear winner. On paper, it's feature rich and allows you to change between classic and remixed visuals on the fly, but again, it's far from ideal. It has its own share of technical issues and glitches, some of which are more pronounced than the Saturn version. Now, this could well be down to compatibility issues, but it's something of a minefield to get the game running in the correct aspect ratio and resolution. Locking the game to 30 FPS requires a third-party app, and even if you do manage to get that sorted, the gameplay still doesn't feel right and collision detection is way off, making it an even worse option than the 32X. The Saturn port then becomes the best port, albeit by default. The visual glitches aren't as pronounced and most of the gameplay is present, correct, and never slows down. And while yes, the visual glitches are an eyesore in replays, they aren't as prominent or distracting during gameplay, and as a teenager in 1995, I was so in awe of the game, I didn't even notice. In terms of accessibility, all you need is a Saturn and a copy of the game, which goes for less than £10 these days. And if the glitching visuals really annoy you that much and you don't mind a visually unauthentic arcade experience, then there's always Virtua Fighter Remix. What about emulation though? Visually, Virtua Fighter runs brilliantly on MAME, which is where most of this footage was captured. It looks and sounds great, but if you look closely, you may have noticed the biggest issue. Collision detection is broken. Unfortunately, this has been the case for 3 years and it still hasn't been resolved, and it makes the game borderline unplayable. It's a shame, and we can only hope that someone in the community is able to fix it. An emulated version did however make its way to the Astro City Mini. I've yet to get my hands on one, so haven't tried it yet, but there have been multiple reports of slowdown to varying degrees. For the closest arcade experience, that may be the way to go, but by all accounts, even 30 years on, playing Virtua Fighter in its arcade perfect form is still no closer to a reality. After playing all the options available, the Saturn port is still the most well-rounded and consistent. It's ironic that it gets flack today, yet modern and substantially more powerful hardware struggles to provide a comparable experience to the original Saturn version.
30 years on, what is Virtua Fighter's legacy? We've already established that it's not just the likes of Tekken, or Toshinden, or Dead or Alive, or Soul Calibur that owe a debt of gratitude to Yu Suzuki's masterpiece, but hardware does too. The PlayStation would literally not exist as we know it had it not been for Virtua Fighter. In fact, if you imagine Sony taking on Sega and Nintendo at the time when 2D was at its height, the PlayStation 1 probably would have been dead on arrival. But it goes beyond that. Shigeru Miyamoto stated that Virtua Fighter was a game that he wished he created, and that he wouldn't create a fighting game as he was beaten to the punch when Virtua Fighter came out, and that any fighting game that he produced would have been perceived as an attempt to copy Virtua Fighter. It's not just Miyamoto. John Romero of id cited Virtua Fighter as one of the primary influences of Quake. Similarly, Toby Gard said that it influenced Tomb Raider. Even in the 2000s, Team Ico's Fumito Ueda had cited Virtua Fighter as an influence on his animation work. Even outside of gaming, Virtua Fighter has achieved recognition for its contribution to the field of technology, which has meant that it even finds itself in the Smithsonian Museum of American History for what it brought to the table. The arrival of Virtua Fighter served as the start of a 3D focus in gaming. The PlayStation became 3D focused, and by extension Saturn's 3D processing power was bolstered. Before Virtua Fighter, there was a hesitance to creating polygonal humanoids in games, yet once Yu Suzuki demonstrated how it could be done, that was all that anybody wanted. It's safe to say that the industry as we know it would not exist were it not for Virtua Fighter. Tekken, Soul Calibur and Dead or Alive are still huge franchises that simply wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Virtua Fighter. Even fighting games that stick to a 2D field of movement, such as Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, now use the sort of motion captured movement and shifting camera angles that were pioneered by Virtua Fighter. And it's not just fighters. Near every game rendered with 3D characters owes a debt to Virtua Fighter. Now, you could argue that another game would have come along and pushed the industry in that direction if it wasn't for Virtua Fighter, but at the end of the day it was Yu Suzuki's works that did it first, and that did it so early that peers and rivals were scrambling around for a response. Even Sega themselves weren't ready, and they were forced to re-evaluate their approach to home hardware and game design in a very short window. Every new numbered entry in Virtua Fighter has pushed the envelope in terms of what has been possible. Even the latest entry, Virtua Fighter 5, which is some 15 years old now, in its final and ultimate forms was very well received. Sega created the fighting game genre in 1976, and then they changed the entire industry again 17 years later. While we all hold out hope for a 6th game in the Virtua Fighter franchise, it's only right that 30 years on, not just Sega fans or fighting fans, but anyone who has picked up a controller in the last 30 years gives Virtua Fighter the respect that it deserves. So, find out a way to play it, whether it's PC, Sega Saturn 32X, whether you get the Astro City Mini. However you decide to play it, you owe it to yourself as a gamer, as a fan of the hobby, to give it its due. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe for more Sega Guys content such as Sega Guys Race, Sega Guys Fight, Sega Guys Review and our fortnightly Sega Guys podcast. You can find us on X or Twitter. You can find me at Swooper_D. You can find James the Segaholic at the Segaholic. You can find the Sega Guys account at Sega Guys. But until next time, we will see you on the Sega side.